Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to our 18th annual conference on America's founding principles and history, this year focusing on civil disagreement and civil disobedience. My name is Elizabeth Coffer-Bush, and I'm co-director of the Center for American Studies, and I'm delighted to be introducing us to our keynote address today. Before I do, I wanted to direct folks to the back cover for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have our sponsors to thank, and that includes Vidal Dickerson and his office, as well as Dean Tatiana Rizova and the Department of Leadership and American Studies, among which also are the Jack Miller Center, IHI, and others. Please take a look. And then you'll also see a wide array of books from our speakers, and we've got a number of them available for purchase. And if you are lucky, you might be able to convince a few to give their signature. So our keynote address, we have both books here, and I have twisted his arm to sign a few afterwards if anyone's interested. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce us to our moderator and our speaker today, which this is going to be a different format. We're going to have a conversation instead of a lecture. And then there'll be time for question and answer at the end. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to the Honorable William Cleveland Mims. And I'm beginning to think that you need a president's name in your name to become someone of high office in the United States or in Virginia. We are very fortunate to have Professor Mims here at Christopher Newport. He is our pre-law director, and also he teaches American Studies courses. He's a former senior justice on the Supreme Court of Virginia and a former member of the Virginia General Assembly and former Attorney General of Virginia. So he's only the second person in Virginia history to hold these three offices. He presently is a lecturer here, and as I mentioned, a pre-law director, and he'll be asking some questions today of our keynote speaker. So our keynote speaker, Dr. John Inazu, is a Sally Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. He also holds a courtesy appointment in political science. His scholarship focuses on First Amendment freedoms, particularly speech, assembly, and religion, as well as their implications in legal and political theory. He's authored a number of notable works, and he's going to talk primarily today about his most recent work, Learning to Disagree, but we will also bring up topics related to confident pluralism. He earned his JD and Bachelor in Engineering at Duke University, so maybe that will come up today, how he moved into the legal profession. And then he earned a PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before entering academia, he clerked for Judge Robert J. Woolman of the U.S. Supreme Court of Appeals in the Eighth Circuit and served as an associate general counsel with the Department of the Air Force at the Pentagon. Again, something that might be fodder for questions later. In addition to his academic roles, he's senior fellow with Interfaith America and the Trinity Forum and has founded the Carver Project and the Legal Vocation Fellowship. His work emphasizes the importance of pluralism and empathetic engagement across deep differences in society. So please join me in welcoming our two speakers, and hope to have you have some Q&A at the end.
So, Professor, when I was asked by my chairman to do this, and when chairman asked, you do, I said, oh my gosh, you want me to interview or to have a conversation with him? I'm a fanboy. I tell my students, James Madison, John Marshall Harlan, and I have now added you to that group. So it's a rather auspicious group to be part of.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And I also listened carefully to what she just said. So my first question is, you're a lawyer and a professor, but you started out as an engineering major at Duke. How do you get to be from an engineering major to a distinguished professor of law and political science?
Well, first, thanks so much for doing this, Justice Mims. It's an honor to be up here with you and Dr. Bush and everyone else for putting this together. It's great to be with all of you. For me, the easy, straightforward answer to that question is I was an engineer, not super by choice. I was at Duke on an ROTC scholarship, and the deal was they paid for Duke and I majored in engineering. And about 2 weeks into college, I realized I didn't really like engineering that much, but I loved Duke and I loved free. And so I stayed with this engineering major and graduated with a civil engineering degree. And then, desperate to get out of engineering, I thought, I don't know anything about law. I've never talked to a lawyer. I've never met a lawyer, but I know it's not engineering, so this might be a next good thing. And so I went to law school purely to escape engineering, and then along the way, that turned out to be the thing that clicked a little better. So I think, one of the points to observe now, especially for those of you who are now in college, is you really, especially in the early years of college, it's hard to know necessarily what you're about or what's going to make you tick, and sometimes it takes a long time. In my case, it took a lot of years to figure out what the right thing was.
And you didn't mention, but you also have a doctorate from UNC. So I'm just going to get right into the hardest question of the day. Are you a Blue Devil or a Tar Heel?
Yeah, that is a hard question. Easily answered. No, the answer is Duke all the way. It does, though, raise the question of this theme of disagreement in life and navigating disagreement. So typically, if you have sort of any kind of mixed allegiances in your academic history, it's the undergrad that positions you because it's the undergrad that forms you. So I went to a lot of games at Cameron Indoor as an undergrad, and despite loving quite a bit about UNC, that never really clicked over and captured me in the way that Duke basketball did, and I should say does.
And Cooper Flagg appreciates
Cooper
that,
Flagg,
I'm sure.
it's a good year to be a Duke fan, let's put it that way.
No kidding, no kidding. You have written about your family, about being a husband and a father. Tell us just a little bit about your family in that regard.
Yeah, well, so one of the things as we get into this book, which is called Learning to Disagree, the book itself kind of combines my professional work with the personal and just a lot of lived experiences that have led me to think about disagreement. And of course, we all come from families, so we all know that families are part of disagreement, and that continues to be the case. But in my case, my wife Caroline and I have 3 kids. They're 17, 15, and 12. And while we do disagree some of the time, it's mostly a lot of fun. And these are fun ages to be engaging as a parent. So our oldest is about to go off to college. And so we're on the cusp of realizing, having taught for a long time at a college, now realizing, oh, my kid's going to be here. That's going to change the way I think about the universe of higher education a bit.
That will be. We need to have you come back.
Right. What have I learned? Right, exactly.
That's right. And it's really interesting. You've already mentioned the book. I just asked about family, and you use the term formed you. We talk here about education, maturing, but we talk a lot about formation. And I think that's one of the things that makes Christopher Newport special. Combining all 3 of those, I want to ask you about one of the aspects of the book, and that is your father is Japanese American, and you have written about your family's experience in World War II, being in an internment camp. Your father was born there. I'm going to ask some questions about civil liberties later, and so as a foundation, I'm curious, did that family experience, even though it came before your generation, to what extent did that form your family, and to what extent did that potentially form you and how you feel about various rights that we have?
Yeah, first of all, I love the fact that you name and talk about formation here, because that gives, it's a clue to me that this institution is naming a purpose and a mission maybe more thickly than a lot of other schools can these days. Yeah. Formation is critical to living into what you're trying to be and what kind of student and graduate you're trying to produce. And this does play a huge role in my own life and in this book as well. And I'm grateful too that you open here by asking about my family history and how that colors the lens through which I see my own work and my own experience. So I've spent my career on civil liberties as a First Amendment scholar, talking about freedoms of speech and assembly and religion. And all of that is colored by the family history of realizing that was taken away in really dramatic form and at great cost. And so I think I am someone who comes at, when I think about politics and national politics, I am someone who's skeptical of who's in power, no matter who it is, no matter which party they represent, because in American history and in my own life, the people in power, whoever they are, often start to become blind to their own mistakes and to what they might learn from their political opponents. It's not often remembered that the key architects of the Japanese internment were Franklin Roosevelt and Earl Warren, who we today look at as sort of leaders of a kind of liberal civil liberties front edge in the mid 20th century. And yet these were the very people who locked up the Japanese Americans for a number of years. So I think about it historically and then personally as well. So, and as I write in the book, I had grown up with these stories my whole life, and having heard from my grandmother before she died about what life was like in the camps, but it never had crystallized for me in a deeply personal way until I visited the site of Manzanar internment camp, which I did 3 years ago. And for me, the difference of hearing these stories or reading about them in books and actually standing on the physical space where my family had been incarcerated. In their case, there were 7 of them after my dad was born, and they were in a 600 square foot, they called them apartments, but they were really cells. And they were there for 2.5 years in the middle of the California desert. And to stand there and try to imagine what life must have looked like, and then to have walked the trek from where my grandmother walked from that spot to the camp hospital where my dad was born. It just brought the whole thing to life. And I think especially kind of solidified what the cost was, that this was a very real and deep human cost. And so then to think about trying to share that story, but also how it affects our day-to-day now when we think about things like disagreement and difference, that I feel very privileged and grateful to be sitting here at a university talking to you and not locked up and deprived of all of my freedoms.
Yeah, exactly. Now he mentioned 7 people living in 600 square feet. I'm not an engineer. I just did a quick calculation. That's about 4 to 5 times the size of this riser. So if you had 4 or 5 of these risers together, 7 people living in that space for over 3 years. That's sober for those of us who appreciate all the creature comforts that we have today. You also, in that context, write about President Reagan signing the legislation providing reparations for those who were still living and who had been in internment, had been incarcerated. That's really, I think, the appropriate word. I want to get into the concepts of forgiveness and atonement in public life. And in order to get there, those are questions of faith. Those are deeply held faith-based values that don't often or don't always transfer over into public life. I will ask more than one question about our current president, but I can't really imagine him seeking forgiveness or thinking in terms of atonement. To what extent in public life should there be that sense of forgiving, atoning, making things right from the past in order to move into a better future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a super complicated question. So let me start with the observation that in our political society as human beings, one thing we know is that we are going to keep harming each other for the rest of our lives. We are both going to suffer harm and injustice, and we are going to perpetuate harm and injustice against other people. So the political question is, what do you do with that? What do you do with the fact that people are hurt in our society over and over again? And what the law tries to do, as you all know, is come in and try to right wrongs and remedy injustices, but the law can never achieve perfect justice. The best the law can do is bring in a kind of proximate justice. So I steal your phone from you, I get caught, I won't do it, just as a thought experiment. I get caught, I get punished. Maybe the remedy is you get your phone back and I go to prison for a period of time. But that's not justice, right? You've still experienced this loss of social trust and violation that's not going away. And so there's this continuing injustice that goes on absent something like forgiveness for you for the rest of your life. And this is a very simple example with an iPhone. Think about if you've lost a loved one to violent crime or something like that, or if the government has mistreated you or unfairly incarcerated you or someone you love. What is justice in that setting? Justice is not coming in a purely human form. So that then opens up questions not unrelated to those. I mean, we've had a great day hearing about Oscar Dunn and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, people who also experienced tremendous injustice, and in the face of injustice that will not be fully remedied, what are the alternatives? So one, I think this concept of forgiveness is a possibility, a related concept of hope in a future to come that is going to be better than the one that we've been experiencing or are presently experiencing. And absent hope and justice, absent hope and forgiveness, it's very difficult to think about how you go forward in very hard times. When Desmond Tutu writes the book No Future Without Forgiveness, talking about the South African experience, I think he's making a claim about politics, that there is no future for the shared political entity of South Africa without the possibility of forgiving one another in the midst of these political acts of violence. And I think in the same way, as we think about our current moment in this country, if you don't like where things are, if you feel like you or people you've loved have suffered wrongs, then what is the way forward? Because if you're only vectoring toward a kind of justice, that's going to leave you, I think, ultimately unsatisfied, or you're going to overcorrect and punish the other side too much, and then you're going to need something in return. And so these ideas of forgiveness and hope and reconciliation, I think, are not just sort of pie in the sky religious concepts, but very practical ideas that as a society we need to be thinking about as we look toward the future.
Okay. Looking towards the future, I want to now get into your two books, and I might go back and forth between the two. You wrote Confident Pluralism in 2016. You wrote Learning to Disagree in 2024. Those are two significant years. Is there any irony to those books and those years and the person who was elected president in both?
There's certainly some timeliness to those, I think, for sure. Unanticipated, of course. But I do,
But if only his people would have read the books, maybe things would be different.
Well, I do think I got a lot of questions in the years after 2016 when that Confident Pluralism book came out, asking, well, now that we've had a couple of years of the first Trump administration, do you see things differently? And my answer then and now is no. I think it's the exact same playbook that we're asked to do as citizens, as neighbors, as people in this country, that the effort to live with people who think and believe and act differently than you do about things that really matter is all we have. I mean, I'm still not sure what the alternatives would be. You can either try to win at all costs and play a huge power game and hope that you keep that power for the rest of your lives, which, as we've seen in the last 12 years, good luck with that effort. Or you can try to just withdraw and say, I don't care anymore. I'm packing my bags and going home. But that's not a real kind of politics either. And for most people, especially people with fewer resources, that's not even a possibility in this country. So it seems to me that faced with those suboptimal alternatives, the only possibility is to figure out, how do we do this better? Who are the exemplars in our lives? I don't think we're going to get them from anyone in Washington anytime soon. So who are maybe more local exemplars? What are the practices and the institutions we can work on to try to get better at this? So as we look toward a future, that it's a shared future, because we're not going to resolve these differences. We're not going to suddenly agree as a country that we all think the same about what's good, what's flourishing, what's the best form of human activity or existence. We're just not going to agree on those questions. So in the reality of our disagreements, how do we maintain a country?
Yeah. I was going to ask, are there any exemplars? But, and I will, although you've just given an indication there. I was listening to one of your podcasts on the way down here with Cherie Harder from Trinity Forum, and she asked you, have things gotten worse from 2016 to 2024? And your answer was interesting. We have lost the ability to give grace. That yes, things are not what they were like in 2016. We are not moving in a positive direction. Can you speak to that concept, losing the ability to give grace?
Yeah, I think it's related to this idea of shifting from thinking that our political opponents or the people not like us are wrong to labeling them as evil. And I think a lot of us have felt this in our own lives. If you think somebody's wrong, then there's still the possibility of extending a kind of grace because you're still in conversation with them. One, you might still try to persuade them, but you also might still have lunch with them or be in class with them. When you actually think that somebody is evil, your goal is to minimize their influence in the world. Your goal is to get away from them. And in politics, and this even predates 2016, but increasingly we've seen that the other side is the side that is evil and that has to be shut down at all costs. And related to this is we tend, and I think our news sources and social media exacerbates this, but we tend to sort human beings into these binary categories of heroes and villains. Our people or our politicians are the heroes and those people are the evil villains. And that's not really much of history or present reality, that every human being is some combination of good and bad intentions and manifestations, and there are very few pure heroes and villains. And when we start to tell the story of our country or our politics or our communities around these good and evil narratives, it becomes very hard to give any kind of grace. And relatedly, we then become very prideful and insular about our own team and our own beliefs. We start to say very sanctimoniously, we're on the right side of history, or the arc of justice is bending in our direction, and these kinds of things that are rarely true in the complexity of human interactions, where a lot of the world is actually quite gray and difficult and not in terms of black and white.
Humility is another concept that you write about, and that I think I heard in part in your answer, the need to step away from the ego, the need to step away from I am so right that your wrongness has descended into evil. How do we either in public life, no, in our private lives, how do we cultivate humility that can then spill over into the
I think part of this maybe starts with what we used to call sort of good faith presumptions, and those are rooted in actual human relationships. So if you have a friend and you learn that their politics are different than yours, or their religious beliefs are very different, if they're a friend first, you're usually disposed to give them a little bit of good faith presumption. You're going to say, let's talk about this issue we disagree about, but my starting point is not you're stupid or you're evil or you're ignorant. My starting point is you're my friend and you have a differing view of this than I do, and I want to hear and learn about your view. Maybe I'll even learn something more about why I believe differently, or even strengthen my own viewpoints. This is one of the reasons that our social media interactions are so disastrous, because our social media back and forth are seldom with trusted friends, right? They're often with anonymous people for whom we don't have that trust or that good faith presumption. So we hear something, we see it characterized, and we assume actually the opposite of good faith. We assume the worst, the least charitable read. You must be stupid, you must be ignorant, and then we write back our own sanctimonious response and then rinse and repeat, and that's a lot of our online interactions. So if we can take the time and the effort to start with that presumption that the human being across from us is a thoughtful person, has reasons for their beliefs that are some combination of judgment and values and lived experiences, and that we can maybe hear and learn from them. It doesn't mean we're going to have to agree with them. It doesn't mean we're going to come to the same conclusion about hard issues. And in fact, listening to them might make us conclude, actually, you really are wrong in that, right? Or I really hope you lose at the polls, or that your policy is not enacted because I think what you believe is deeply harmful for society or for human flourishing. But you can still do all of that within the context of a relationship that says, I respect you as a person, I have something to learn from you, and I want to have a conversation, not a monologue.
So here's a negative example of that from quite literally from last night. I won't mention the name, but a high-ranking Homeland Security official was being interviewed on a particular network that is friendly to him and to this administration, and spoke about a commentator on another network and said, she's dumb as a rock. How can we let it be known that that sort of ad hominem statement by a high-ranking official isn't appropriate? Or can we not?
I mean, we have some very bad models right now, and we have had for some time at the national level. And we have, I'm not going to do a both sidesism here, but there are examples from both political parties of people who are rewarded by the ad hominem, snarky attacks. And we see this in high levels of journalism and punditry as well. So I think one of the best antidotes, and we heard about this just in the last session, is use the opportunity and the privilege of being here and learning how to think critically about why it matters to make actual arguments and not just dismiss people. These kinds of soundbite attacks that might get a laugh or might get a television spot do nothing to advance any kind of dialogue or discourse or understanding. Our society rewards them because they give us the dopamine hits, and people like the back and forth, but that doesn't get us to a form of sustainable politics. And by the way, I should say, that part of it is nothing new. I mean, you go back to the election of 1800 and they were throwing the same kind of jabs at each other in their day. And we've seen this for much of human history. But the antidote to that, or the challenge that it raises for us, is for people who have the opportunity to learn and think deeply and how to figure out how to make actual arguments instead of that shortcut nonsense, then it's even more incumbent upon us to listen well and to make a kind of patient argument too that can push past the ad hominem soundbite. So let me make this even more practical than the news commentator. If you're at Thanksgiving dinner, or you're home with a relative or a friend, and you get that snarky comment back, or that really annoying or ignorant comment from some relative of yours, then choose to respond differently, maybe because you have some knowledge or skills or training, and choose to say, you know what, I'm going to absorb in the moment this comment, not because it was right or appropriate, but because I have a set of skills and tools to know what to do here. And instead of just jumping back, I'm actually going to make an argument, or I'm going to ask a question. A question's even better than an argument sometimes. So tell me why you think she's dumb as a rock, right? And actually invite a conversation. It's seldom the case that when someone makes just an insult that they can actually back that up with any kind of credible story. So invite them to walk through their own flaws and shortcomings in the argument, and then see if a conversation can happen.
Yeah, I have to laugh over the election of 1800 because in one of the classes that I teach, we actually put the Sedition Act up on the screen, and then we put up a statement by the singer Shakira, and determined that Shakira has violated the Sedition Act. And I asked my students, what if Shakira was not allowed in the country for the Super Bowl halftime because of her statements that violated the Sedition Act? And one student said, well, then I would have gotten to listen to Bad Bunny twice as much. And so I'm like, okay, well, you're right. So sometimes those historical examples need to be driven home in that manner. Social media. So as a judge, social media was frowned upon. I thankfully don't do social media, but it fascinates me and frightens me. And as somebody who's older, when I'm hearing the debate about social media, it reminds me of the cartoon Pogo way back in the last century, where he says, "We have met the enemy and it is us." No one in here knows who Pogo is, so I'm going to quote Taylor Swift. "It's me, I'm the problem, it's me." Is it indeed social media that's the problem, or is it us who are the problem? How do we move out of that? As social media sticks around and has fewer and fewer guardrails, what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the intuition in your question is any tool itself is typically neutral and that it can be applied in good and bad ways, and it's how those tools are applied. Social media is no different than, say, nuclear fission or print media or whatever it is. So there are good and bad ways to deploy the tool, but the way in which we've seen it used and the way in which we, through our money and our time, have indicated our own preferences align, have pushed us into a hard and often bad path. So the algorithms, which are just responsive to us, are telling us that what we like is the snark and the dopamine and all of the kinds of gotcha sorts of things. The shorter, I mean, at this point, anytime you talk about social media with different aged audiences, you start to have to name, well, what technology are we talking about? Because it's not, I mean, you all are typically on different platforms than I am for sure, but we can all know like those, whether it's a reel or whatever it is, that it's the kinds of attention grabbers that get us the most, that take us away from the longer, the more sustained kind of reflective thinking. And often then, because of humor and all sorts of things, get us excited about often the wrong things. So the punchline here is this, because of the money and the time and all of our revealed preferences, this all seems to be going in a certain direction that is pushing for more and more of this. And none of us is going to be able to outsmart the algorithms and the tech. So all the people with the money realize what we like and they're giving us more of it. And if you think you can kind of, work your way through it with wisdom and discretion, it's going to be very difficult to beat what's coming in on your phone. So you've got to think about, I think, more radical steps to disengage in some ways, because nobody sort of under the hood is trying to make this better for you. And I think about this with my own kids too, as I watch them get involved in different forms of social media. Like the kinds of ways that they are formed and I am formed are unbalanced, not great things. Right? We're more distracted. We're less patient. It's harder for us to follow arguments. It's harder for us to read. I've noticed this too. I mean, that my ability to read in graduate school versus my ability to read now is night and day. And what's been the intervening variable there? Largely because I'm online, just like many of you, right? Getting distracted from the scrolling through different threads and that sort of thing.
So go deeper in that. Apparently, you're saying it's your ability to read and absorb today is less than it was then. But how do you limit, put a guardrail around, control, whatever, your social media use in order to arrest that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still working on this, so I don't think I have it figured out, but I have to sometimes take very kind of rigid and almost formulaic steps. So for example, I try and usually adhere to being offline completely for 24 hours a week. So a full day where I'm just unplugged, no online anything, no social media. And I find that actually putting all that away for a day a week is an incredible reset to just get me out of the headspace of the current buzz. And then I also, and not every job lets you do this, but mine with enough planning does, I take a week a year where we're offline as a family for a complete week. And that's even more sort of resetting and refreshing, because for an entire week, I have no idea what's going on in the world. My world collapses to, we're usually at the beach. So it's my kids at the beach and walking to a coffee shop and maybe reading a book, but there's no news going on. And then so I think that's actually just helpful to getting out of the mess. But another sort of surprising collateral benefit for me is it's a reminder that the world doesn't care about me. and that's actually a good human reminder as well. So this week in the year usually coincides, because it's in the summer, when the U.S. Supreme Court is issuing some of its blockbuster opinions, and some of them are in my area of expertise. And when we know an opinion's coming, I'll have reporters have contacted me in the weeks leading up saying, make sure your phone's on, because when the decision hits, we want to get you a quote and so forth. And sometimes I'm at the beach and Hobby Lobby comes down, and I learn about it 5 days later, and I've missed the quote in the Washington Post or whatever it is, but I also got to throw the football with my son on the beach, and I look back and think, it turns out nobody in the world needed to hear from me. Nobody cared, and life went on, and my life was great too. And it doesn't mean like I don't like that stuff or I don't want to keep doing that stuff, but it does mean almost all of us are far less necessary than we think we are, except to maybe the people closest to us, and that might be the recalibration that we need from time to time.
Gotcha. What do you read at the beach? A couple of quick questions. What do you read at the beach?
It's about the only time in the year I try to read fiction. So between fiction and sort of life management books.
I might need to know what life management books. I'll ask you that.
Well,
later.
I'll give you a great recommendation now. A book called 4,000 Weeks. Anyone know what that stands for?
Your lifetime.
The average number of weeks in a human lifetime. And you and I are well into 4,000. So that it makes you think about how you use your time and what you prioritize in life.
Do you watch TV?
Oh yeah, I watch all kinds of stuff. I'm not sure I should say here, but I watch I binge a lot of television when I can, and sometimes it's hard to stop watching. I just finished Succession. Has anyone seen that?
Oh yeah, I'm seeing it. Yeah. Okay.
It's intense. Yeah.
Jeopardy?
Not Jeopardy.
Not Jeopardy?
No.
Okay.
I watch kind of Netflix, kind of Hulu sorts of things. So just the shows. Yeah.
Movies?
Movies. I like movies too. My kids and I love to go to see movies in the theater, which is fun. I think the last one we saw was Wicked, which was great.
Yeah, definitely. The Dylan movie is good too.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah. So, okay. It's the only movie I've seen in the past 6 months, so it's easy for me to say that. Back into academia. Consensus.
Yeah.
You talked about consensus fairly frequently throughout Confident Pluralism. And then in that podcast that I was listening to on the as I drove here, you basically said that in Learning to Disagree that book is not about consensus. Have your views on our ability to achieve consensus changed, or is it simply that those are two different books aiming at two different conclusions?
Well, I should say that. So when I talk about consensus and confident pluralism, I talk about sort of a modest unity. And by that, I mean, I don't know how we survive as a society without some kind of shared commitment to some basic, rather modest set of commitments. Civil liberties, the importance of free speech for everyone, the importance of religious freedom for everyone, equal protection under the laws. It's very difficult to know how we move forward as a society if half the people in the country just reject that premise. But beyond that, and even in the earlier books, what I wanted to press against was to say, what does it mean for our country to be unified? Because I actually think it's very difficult to name a unified goal when we're in so much disagreement about big questions like, what is a human being? Or what's the nature of human flourishing? Or how can I be a good person in life? Or what happens when I die? We've got massive disagreement about all of those questions, which makes it difficult to name what unity in this country is, absent, I don't know, like we help each other in national disasters. We all like highways, most of us. The Olympics are sometimes good to watch, but that's not the kind of thing that's going to give us a thick consensus of shared citizenship. So short of that, I think the consensus we should be looking for is a commitment to basic democratic practices and commitments. And that's the consensus that I was talking about in Confident Pluralism. I think in this more recent book, what I'm trying to suggest is with that baseline, we can have and we can invite a whole lot of disagreement. to learn about other people who aren't going to see the world the same. And this tags back a little bit to the discussion we just had in the session before this one about what the purpose of the university is, or what it means to bring people of differing viewpoints into a shared space to have meaningful disagreement. And there it becomes very important to know what the limits of debate are, and then how you do that well and robustly. And I actually think, I was reflecting all day today about sort of the shared experience of higher education or the university experience, and the idea that your voice or your perspective might be shouted down, or a speaker might come in and say something or attempt to say something and be shot down from speaking. That certainly happens. It's happened at my university. It's happened to me before, but it's also not my day-to-day experience. I think in most cases with most of my colleagues, we do a pretty good job of inviting different viewpoints and encouraging this kind of debate to recognize that in the absence of consensus, we are going to have to figure out how to talk to each other.
Yeah. As you have gone through, as we've had this conversation, various names and faces have popped into my mind. Nelson Mandela. When you're talking about kind of each of us as individuals in a time, in a season where of great discord, I thought of Václav Havel and Living in Truth, when he had far worse conditions than we have, obviously. I think of Senator John Danforth, who you know. Surely there must be, I'm going to put lawyer speak in here, surely there must be some people in our current season who can be lifted up as paragons, who are worthy of studying, examining, following. Aren't there?
Well, that's a really hard question put me on the spot with this one. I think the three examples you named are all great examples, but part of what contributes to the success of their modeling and advocacy were two things that were now lacking. So one is there was more of an audience, a shared audience to whom they were speaking in all three cases. Yeah. It's difficult to know what the shared audience right now is in our country because of how fractured our news sources and our communities are. So one person's model exemplar is the other person's distrusted leader, and the dissonance between those two views. And then this relates to, I think, a growing and distinct problem is the nature of authority is slipping from us. So it used to be that authority was often attached to roles and responsibilities and sometimes to experience. So Senator Danforth has authority because of his positionality and his life experiences. And today, when we think about authority, it's often tied to whoever happens to have fame at the moment or whoever happens to have the most followers on a particular platform, divorced from positionality or responsibility or sometimes even experience. So in the absence of a shared audience and a commitment to a shared authorities, it becomes much harder to name who those exemplars are, I think particularly at the national level. So I think we have far better possibilities when we start locally, when we start to think about at the institutional level, who are the people at Christopher Newport who model well for you a kind of patience, a kind of leadership that takes very seriously the job of leadership, but takes less seriously the person of the leader. So in other words, don't take yourself so seriously, but have space to laugh at yourself and have space to see the other people around you. Those kinds of models, I think, they're all around the country, but they're much more local and they're much sometimes out of the spotlight. And those are the kinds of people that I think we need to start naming more. I think at the national level, even when we start to identify the exemplars that we want to be our heroes, we often just put too much pressure on them and we quickly discover, actually, they're not as great as we thought, or they've got these massive flaws. So I think that's the long-winded answer to say is let's look more locally and look more in an embodied way at who our leaders and exemplars might be.
You know, we and another name and face just flashed across as you were saying that, because here at Christopher Newport, we're very proud of Cassidy Hutchinson, a Christopher Newport graduate, spoke to the January 6th Commission and spoke truth to power in a true fashion, and is now unfortunately back in the news as potentially as retribution as possible. And so when I think of courage, when I think of leadership, when I think at the local level, she is certainly, and she came back to campus last year and spoke, and it was wonderful to have that up close and personal connection with so many of our students getting to know her. But I think you're right that there are local examples, in fact.
Well, that example in particular, when you think about the people, you know this far more than I do because you spent far more time in the world of politics, but politics, particularly at the national level, has so many perverse incentives to be not who you are, right? To kiss the ring or to do whatever it is for sort of long-term power grabs. And the people who can stand against that, who are formed, back to that formation question, to act differently in the moment, that's not going to happen overnight or by reading a book. That's going to reflect a lifetime of character and formation that prepares you for those moments, because those moments are going to be hard. When you see the goodies or the possibility for power and you see a shortcut to getting there, a lot of us will want to take the shortcut. And it's only by turning to deeper resources and other experiences that we'll be able to say, no, actually, that's the kind of compromise I'm not willing to make.
And Frodo just came into my mind, and Samwise Gamgee.
Yeah.
But that's another conversation for another time. So my time to ask questions is drawing to a close, and so that the students can ask some questions. I hope they will, and we'll take up the remainder of the time. Because I mentioned to Professor Bush, I have 4 pages. I've gotten no more than 6 or 7 hours of asking you questions, and I've gotten through about a page and a half. But I'm hoping the students will foreclose that. Got one more though. Your children, 2 teens and a preteen. One of them going off to college not too long from now. What have they taught you about learning to disagree with empathy and respect?
Yeah, well, I could answer this for a long time, but I'm going to share one story that I have shared in a few other contexts about my oldest, who's 17. She'll be a college freshman next year. And this was kind of after I'd written the book, but was thinking about all these ideas of how do you disagree well and what does it look like to disagree. And it just so happened that she and I got into a pretty heated discussion about a political issue that we disagreed over. And she's a very smart person. I also have read a lot more than she has at this stage in life. So I had, I think, better, more informed arguments than she did about this particular issue. So she would make a point and I would say, well, honey, actually you haven't read X, Y, and Z, and here's why you've overclaimed and we did this for a while. And then I had my glasses off at the time. My wife walked into the room and she looked at me and she said, just so you know, she's over there crying right now. And in that moment, I realized that the massive mistake I had made was to go into law professor mode with my daughter, who actually just needed a dad and not an interrogator. And so I think a couple of the things that example represents of what my own kids have taught me. One is the only thing in that moment, the only proper action in that moment is to apologize. And so my kids have taught me some about what it means to apologize, because it didn't matter anymore whether I was right or I had the better argument. The fact of that reality was that I had fundamentally misunderstood my role in the moment, and I had lost I'd lost the thread and lost the moment. And so I think the recognition that as a parent I still get it wrong all the time. But then the other maybe related reminder there is that we are always in life interacting with people with different roles and different levels of authority and different kinds of engagement. And we need to be aware of where we are, right? I have a very different conversation with my daughter than I do with my students or my colleagues or the chancellor of the university or whoever it is. And if I'm not aware of what the relationship is, what the power dynamic looks like, then I might miss the cue of how I'm supposed to engage in that moment. And at that point, it doesn't really matter how good my argument is because I've misunderstood the role.
Yeah. That's wisdom. Thank you. Questions?
I'm going to kick it off.
Okay.
If it's not working, I can talk louder. So I'm wondering, in a concrete fashion, what can a university, and I usually think in terms of public universities because there's more legal restraints on a public university, to cultivate confident pluralists, but a corollary to that is, do universities have an obligation to cultivate confident pluralism? And maybe start with just a briefing for those less familiar with that concept.
Yeah, so with the term confident pluralism, all I mean to convey is, we've already touched on some of this, but we live in, descriptively and factually, we live in a world where the people around us are going to think very differently than we do about a lot of things that really matter. And those differences are not going away. So we're stuck with these other human beings for the rest of our lives, and we're gonna have to figure out what it means to live with that disagreement and really, as we pursue different views of the good, we're actually in contest with some of those people. We're trying to win elections. We're trying to elect people who will support our cause and not theirs. And at the same time, we need to continue to relate to them as fellow citizens and neighbors. So how do we do that? How do we engage with them? How do we protect their rights, even to advance the causes that we think are bad in the world? So I do, in my day job, I spend a lot of time writing about protests, and I end up engaging with and arguing for and advocating on behalf of protesters across the ideological spectrum, some of whom I think are very wrong, but I absolutely believe in their right to protest. And so I'm committed to the principle that we have to be doing this well for each other, including the people we don't like or we don't agree with. Now, in the university system or setting, how do we do this well? I think so much of this and a lot of the current tensions that people are feeling in colleges and universities has come from or arisen out of a lack of clarity of purpose of the institutional and educational mission. So, and actually it's a little easier, I think, to name at a self-consciously liberal arts institution that says we're here to learn these ideas. It's a lot harder at my institution, which I love, but we've got lots of things going on, and we're a hedge fund and a real estate holding company and a big medical complex, and somewhere in the midst of that, we're also doing education, but it's not always clear where that priority is. But if you start with the commitment to education and a certain kind of discourse that's helping you cultivate disagreement, figuring out how to advocate with people who are different than you, forming citizens and future leaders, then that sets some of the rules of the game. So one thing, even at a public university, subject to the constraints of the First Amendment, you can say, as leaders and student leaders and faculty and administrators, there's a kind of discourse to which we're committed. And we want to bring in differing opinions about hard issues. But if you're going to come here, there are certain rules of the game that we expect. We're not going to invite the flamboyant media personality who's going to come in and throw snarky sound bites and make attacks. We're going to bring someone who's actually studied hard this issue and put them in conversation with someone else who's studied hard the issue. And that's how we learn together through that commitment. And I think the other thing is just to realize, and I think of this every year and share it with my own students, if we can't figure this out here in these settings, then where else in the world is this going to happen? I mean, think about what it means to be in a class with people at Christopher and Newport. And it's a little harder maybe with bigger classes, but imagine a small class you're in where you're gonna be in the same room with the same group of people for, let's call it 13 weeks, reading common texts and then having discussions over the meaning and the implication of those texts. And then you get to go away for a while and think about it and then come back again. And that comment you heard from someone else last week that you didn't like, you can maybe bring it up again, or you could read something differently. That's the best possible case of how we learn to do this well. And so if we're not doing it here, or if I'm not doing it with my students, it's not gonna happen when you graduate and go out to a busy life with jobs and laundry and all of that. I mean, some of you have that here as well, but to preserve those moments where week in and week out, you get to go with the same group of people and have an ongoing conversation. That's remarkable. And I mean, I think for those of us who are teachers, to be able to do that with students, it's a huge responsibility and a privilege. And I think the urgency that we might increasingly feel about where this is not happening in society should just make us double down on our own efforts to do it here.
I get the impression, because I've spent a day with you, that you're a naturally affable and easygooing individual.
Can we record that for my wife? Just to
I said it was an impression.
Was just on social media. Yeah.
This doesn't come naturally to a lot of us. And of course, social media stirs that up. And the extent to which we politicize everything stirs that up. So what advice do you have to those of us who are not naturally able to respect the dignity of others or get past a personal position?
Yeah, I think part of it starts with just recognizing your own flaws and imperfections. And actually, the class of people who are professors and academics, we're not very good at this as a class because we study something very specialized and we become maybe the world's expert at it, and we spend our careers sort of telling people why they're wrong and why we understand it better than they do. Those are not skills or traits that lend themselves to sort of self-reflection sometimes. So I think for a lot of us, it has to be reminding ourselves that we have things to learn from everyone we encounter. This also means be sure to have friends in your lives who are truth tellers to you and who can say, you know what, you're not as clear as you think you are. You don't have it as figured out as you think you do. And I've been very, privileged or cursed to have a lot of those people in my life. And so in the day-to-day, I'm reminded of that a lot, I think, which is good. And then, the last piece to that comment is we're not going to develop these abilities and practices with online engagement. So if you find yourself at some kind of internal dissonance with how you treat people in person versus how you treat people online, then think hard about how to move more in one direction and less than the other, because it's going to be very difficult to sustain over time, basically a split personality.
Yeah, question over here.
Early on, you touched about presidency and that as a whole. Would you be able to elaborate on what, or maybe define what you mean about the playbook and what what we are asked to do as citizens when faced with a new presidency, or even one that we feel like we've seen before?
Yeah, so I think, and there are people in this room who know more about this than I do, but I would say the executive branch and the office of the presidency in the last 5 administrations particularly has made a kind of collective power grab that feels very harmful to me. And notice the last 5 administrations cross both parties, but when you think about how the White House uses executive orders, how it circumvents the legislative process to enact policy, which it was not intended to do, these are structural changes that we're seeing, I think regardless of your politics, we're seeing the consequences play out. And one of the ways you can even sort of generalize the consequences is, regardless of what you think about certain issues, it seems like a dumb way to run a country to have the policy reversal happen every 4 years, right? So you get an executive order from one administration, 4 years later it's rescinded, you get the opposite order. If you're an actual business or a college or a person whose life is dependent upon certain benefits or regulations, and it's upended every 4 years, it's going to be impossible to figure things out. And that's effectively where we are. Not just the fault of the presidency, though, because one of the reasons we have all of this power consolidating in the executive branch is the legislative branch has proven that it can't get anything done, right? So we're not having meaningful legislation enacted. We're not having people talk to each other. You mentioned Senator Danforth, back in the day, and my understanding of the legislature was always the requirement of compromise, which means you're going to push hard for legislation and get something that nobody really likes, but everyone can live with. And instead it's now, I win or it doesn't happen. So these are all the things that we've seen, and they're here. And then I think your question, which is a really important one, is, okay, well, that's nice descriptively, but what do we do about it? And I don't know. I think we work hard. You double down your efforts to elect the people that you want, and look for people who are committed to institutional integrity and long-term structural protections for democracy, who can demonstrate or have demonstrated that they're willing to put the sake of the system and the country above their own interests. And I just think, there are fewer and fewer of those people out there, but look for who they are, and then look for the people who have gone back on their word and who are not actually consistent in this, and don't, this is kind of the fool me once thing, right? If they have proven to you that they are not going to honor their commitments, that they're not going to act as citizens who are putting the interests of the country first, then make sure that they're not getting your support.
Do you think the Supreme Court has pushed back against legislators who won't compromise and executives who are engaging in overreach in some of their more recent decisions?
Yeah, so the court, the Supreme Court right now is a super interesting institution, and it gets, a lot of bad press in certain circles. I'm not a fan of everything the Supreme Court does, but I will say, as an institution of government, it's our best bet by far right now. And there are, I think there are sort of oversimplified narratives about the Supreme Court, particularly from some left of center media sources that want to say that they're all just kind of, they're all in Trump's pocket or whatever it is. I just think that's not true, and it's an irresponsible claim to be making, that the court as an institution has generally held in some important ways. And I think, generally speaking, it models a kind of governance that we are not seeing in the other branches of government. And it doesn't mean they're perfect. It doesn't mean that they're free of bad actors. I could have all kinds of critiques to lobby about and toward the Supreme Court. But I do think that, by and large, these are very smart people who are committed to an ongoing tradition of legal and constitutional interpretation. They disagree about how that plays out, and there are some decisions that are just almost irreducibly political, but not all of them. And they're people who, by the nature of the institution, you know this from your own experience at the state level, but you are forced into a room of people and you have to talk to them and you share meals with them. And it's a smaller group than the legislative body, and that does something on a human level. It doesn't mean it's perfect or bulletproof, but it seems a lot better than shouting at the person online who you never actually talk to. So I would say there's maybe mixed reviews right now of the U.S. Supreme Court, but don't give up on it completely.
Hi. When you were asked about social media, you talked about how the rise of social media has caused kind of a decrease in things like patience. I was wondering if you notice any differences in what you're thinking about, how much you're thinking, and what your mentality is during those weeks that you take a hiatus from media.
Yeah, no, I love this question. I don't even have to go to those weeks. Like, I notice this like hour to hour when I'm, and probably like a lot of you, I'm just almost self-consciously or reflexively starting to scroll. On the airplane here, right, where I'm teaching a class on law and theology, so I was supposed to be reading Augustine on the plane here, but instead, because Delta now gives me free Wi-Fi, I'm scrolling through, Threads and Blue Sky and like finding out the latest about some spat between Taylor Swift and right. Why do I care about none of this? None of this affects my life, but I'm just reactive to the next thing on my feed. And then when I can finally put it down and spend 20 minutes reading Augustine, it's like a night and day change in just how I'm actually interpreting the words that I'm reading, where my headspace is. And at the end of that, I think, well, clearly one of these is preferable to the other, and yet clearly I do the exact same mistake, the next day. But I think if you've had the experience, you could even start small, right? Just put your phone, turn it off, or put it in another room, or leave it in your dorm or your apartment and go to a coffee shop without it, and just with a book, and see what happens, in a couple of hours. Your mind can go all kinds of places. Or I also go on a walk and just without music or without a phone, and just think and see what happens after an hour of walking and thinking. It's remarkable. And then I think, why don't I do this all the time? And then I'm right back to scrolling.
Hi. So you said a lot of things about, recognize that you're imperfect, recognize that you have flaws. And I think a lot of people today would find that shocking. It would break their sort of insular bubble. Should we be shocked when that bubble is broken? Should that be something that we have all the time? And do you think media is playing a role in that?
Well, it's interesting because I think we talked earlier about the importance of forgiveness, and I think key to actually living out something like forgiveness is knowing that you are in need of forgiveness, which means you're not perfect and you screw it up sometimes, but also knowing that you're capable of being forgiven, which means that you're not defined by your worst mistake and you're not as bad as whoever they are might say you are. And that very human response to being situated in a way that allows you the capacity to forgive and be forgiven is part of this recognition of who you are. So then you asked, what's the connection here to social media? This is not new because we've had this. I mean, even when I was a kid, I remember all of this, but we set up these fake interpretations of people's lives that say, now we've got filters and all these other things to help, right? You look perfect. Your life is perfect. On Instagram, you're just putting up pictures of your perfect friends, always being perfectly happy. And of course, nobody lives life this way, right? Most of life is just kind of complicated and mundane and sometimes hard, and sometimes you're tired and sometimes you don't look great or you're not thinking well, and that's okay. And so I think the tie-in here is make sure you have relationships with real human beings who can see your imperfections, and then through that relationship, and you can see theirs, and then you realize, you know what, and we're still going to hang out, and we're still going to be friends, and I'm still going to have a meal with you, because even though I know you're screwed up and you know I'm screwed up, we still care about each other, and this is how we get along in real life, not that life out there that looks perfect and filtered and conflict-free.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. Really interesting discussion. I was reminded in your conversation and the importance of disagreement and a civil disagreement. One of the things that our center does is we host a Constitution Day debate where we bring in opposing people with opposing viewpoints and sort of give them the opportunity to sort of make their case and debate on a controversial topic. But part of the real purpose of that event is to get people to see that people can disagree without simply vilifying the other side. So maybe we'll bring you to debate someone at some point. But my question actually has to do with something that you mentioned in the discussion earlier, where you mentioned, the sort of the mission of a university. Liberal arts college might be one thing, a larger university might be the other. But that sort of raised the question: what is the purpose of a university in providing an education? So, open-ended question, but I'd be really interested to hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I love that. I think a lot about this question. I think part of the answer is it's not a generalizable answer. So West Point is going to give a different answer to that question than Morehouse, than Notre Dame, than the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And so the way... Exactly, right. And we can go on. So the answer is context specific and institution specific. But then I think that once you know what your context is, and once you know what kind of institution you are, that those should help you define a mission and a purpose and a set of values. And what that does, and this is where I think a lot of university administrators get hung up, naming a mission and a purpose is helpful, but it also constrains, because when you say this is our purpose, you're also saying, and these are all the things we're not doing, because that's not our purpose. A lot of universities today will say, we're going to have a strategic plan to figure out where we're going next, and here are our 16 priorities. Well, that's not a purpose, right? That's trying to appease all of your different stakeholders. And then in a university setting, who do you have? I'm laughing to myself because there's a former college president here who knows a lot more about this than I do, but your stakeholders are your teachers and your students and your alumni and your donors and sometimes the legislators and other political actors. And if you've got a sports team, sometimes the athletes and the fans and then business holders. And if you've got grants from the NIH, then people in government, all of these different stakeholders who are clamoring for different emphases and attention to purpose. And then you as a leader have to say, no, this is our purpose. This is what we're about. This is who we're serving. This is the kind of people we're trying to produce. And then you've got to say that over and over again, because with undergraduates, they cycle in and out every 4 years. And it turns out you might have said that really well for 4 years, but if you don't keep saying it, the new group of people will have no idea what you're talking about. So find out what it is. I would hope that in a liberal arts setting, it has something to do with formation of people to think and live and act differently as citizens in this country with a set of responsibilities that comes with an education, and then make sure that what you're doing day in and day out reinforces that purpose. Without that, you're going to be in that place where all the people are telling you all the things they want you to do.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this session. I want to thank Professor Mims and Dr. Inazu. Please join me.